And I think this backdrop is really, really important for talking about this development around inclusive leadership, because being able to engage in inclusive leadership is a developmental journey in which we are skilling ourselves more deeply to actually follow principles of participation, inclusion, and valuing difference. Let's talk about leadership in that developmental process. I always like this quote. It's attributed to Michelangelo when he was asked how he sculpted the statue of David. You just chip away at everything that doesn't look like David. I heard it also when I was out of Stanford. I heard it also apply to Rodin too. You know, how do you sculpt that thing? It's like I saw the big block of whatever. I just saw what was underneath it. I just got the other stuff out of the way. And so this whole notion of how it is that I develop an inclusive leadership mindset is about how it is I get rid of things that are preventing me from being able to do this. And then obviously, from my perspective, flows from an assumption that our capacity to do this is the default. And that frequently a lot of stuff comes on top of that that diminishes our capacity. Here comes weirdness. Let me be specific in what I'm talking about with weirdness, because I want to be a little more rigorous in the definition. One's weirdness derives from a unique set of attributes and experiences that a person internalizes that motivate her or him to think, feel, and behave in counter-normative ways. So I'm talking about weirdness really as this thing that sets us apart from the context in which we sit. It probably stands to reason, you can probably see that weirdness is not some general thing. It's not like, the classic kid who sits, a coder who sits in the basement of his mother's house and does stuff. That's one weird dude. You know, I sort of thought about that at first. Sorry if any of you were that dude. Sorry, apologize, don't mean it. But what was interesting is when I began to do some of the empirical work, I said, yes, that's what it is. I'm going to get myself out to Silicon Valley. I'm going to start doing interviews with some people. And lo and behold, guess what I found is that when I got out there and got in context, those people weren't weird at all. They had found contexts in which they were all the same. And so it didn't further my research, didn't further the questions I was wanting to ask. So now I'm becoming much more discerning and finding people who are in fact outliers within their context, specifically within their teams. And we can talk about that piece of the research if you're interested too. But conceptually, I'm defining weirdness as being something that is not just about being different or unique, but it's something that's characterized by a valence of experience that actually is aversive or negative. I'll talk about that a little bit different. So it's about differentiation and standing out, but it's not always felt and experienced as standing out in a good way. It doesn't internally feel that way. Obviously, it is context dependent. Weird in one place is not weird in another place. So it depends on what you're talking about. It is characterized, especially the research tells us, it's characterized by feelings of isolation and alienation. That the kind of weirdness I'm talking about comes attached to this feeling of being alone, being sort of separate. People have different relationships to that feeling. Some people are kind of taken down by it a little bit. Some people are fine with it, they thrive with it. Some people don't care one way or the other. But they all talk about that being a part of their experience. And again, it's largely distinct, distinct from that largely positive experience. So look at me, I'm unique, I'm special, I'm something. That's not really what I'm talking about. Weirdness in the way that I'm talking about it, which is part of why I use the word. I've had colleagues push back on the use of the word. They say, well, Martin, why don't you use uniqueness or distinctive? It's like, no, I want weird. That thing that makes you feel, I don't like that. That's exactly what I want. So this notion of it being distinct from this feeling special. And finally, in my definitions, I think about it, I'm looking at the weirdness that adds value. That within team context and organizational context, it's weirdness that's creating something positive. Because as we all can understand, I think there's lots of weirdness and distinctness that's quite destructive. It's quite dangerous, it's quite dysfunctional. And I think that's important and worthy of study. That's not my thing. That's not what I'm focusing on right now. I'm actually focusing on this notion of value added weirdness. Quick example of what I mean when I say that. So he ignored even the most basic tasks of self-maintenance. Not only did he bathe very rarely, he rarely even changed his clothes, sleeping in full regalia, shoes included. His assistant once complained that he's sometimes gone so long without taking off his shoes that the skin came away from his feet like a snake's in the boots. This behavior may have been, the author writes, may have been a result of autism, which also likely caused his social awkwardness, his reluctance to interact with people, and tendency to just walk away from a person in the middle of a conversation. That's what this dude did. It was also likely his autism that let him focus on his work obsessively and sacrifice absolutely everything else in his life, which of course allowed him to create this. That's an psychobiography of Michelangelo. I got a Michelangelo thing, as you can tell. But it's so important, captures this whole notion of productive weird, a weird that does something, that creates something that's really powerful and important. The question then became, when I think about the model, how is it that we begin to explore weirdness? What are the approaches? What are the tools? What are the practices that allow that to happen? I'm going to spend a little time on that and talk about that. But at this point, let me just sort of invite, are there questions or thoughts or insights about what I've shared so far?
Awesome, so we can open it up to a few questions from the class. If you're in the class and you want to go to the participants tab and click raise your hand, we would love to offer you the floor. Awesome, I see Ashley has raised her hand. Ashley, you are unmuted.
Okay.
Hi, thank you for being with us. I guess I'm just wondering how to draw the line in terms of like weirdness versus something else. So for example, if someone doesn't subscribe to like office etiquette or business etiquette in terms of like attire, if someone shows up to the office in like a t-shirt and jeans, like, is that being weird or is that borderline like inappropriate?
That's a good question. The labeling of weirdness, inappropriateness, as I'll get to in a moment, is kind of a subjective thing. The way that I would encourage the thinking about where the line is drawn goes back in organizations, and perhaps also to societies as well, but certainly in organizations it goes back to strategic intent. So I'm often thinking about, what's the mission of your organization? Who are you and what are you about? Why do you exist? What is your larger purpose? That sets the boundary around which we determine what's weird, what's not weird, what fits, what doesn't fit. And that line, granted, is kind of variable because it's going to shift and change, but the line does exist. And so actually the extent to which, what kind of weirdness is weirdness that works versus weirdness that's just really out of bounds is determined in large part by that line. And I think that line is shaped by leaders in the organization, it's shaped by collective action in the organization, it's shaped by a variety of things, but the line does exist. Does that help? Okay, great. Is there another?
Awesome. And I see
looks like Hannah
Riley Bowles. Yeah.
Hannah.
You're unmuted,
and
Hannah.
Katie, I'll jump in after Hannah because I don't see a hand raising function for the host, but I want to ask a question if that's okay.
Okay, great. Awesome.
Good.
Thank you.
Hi, Martin. Just because I'm really just jumping in with enthusiasm because you can't see us non-verbally, but I just love the clarity of your slide about defining inclusive leadership. It's just one of the most, I don't know, you just seem to have really got it all in that slide in a way that was so clear and hung together. And so I wanted to just thank you for that. And then I also really love, and I'm looking forward to hopefully hearing more about your idea of going from a surface level to a deeper identity and how that relates to inclusiveness. Because I love that we've been having conversations about leadership development. Robert and I were just on a call yesterday, and part of the big debate was, well, wait a minute, you can't make leader development just about yourself, that it has to be fundamentally integrated in context. And so anyways, I'm just expressing verbally what you'd probably see on my face if I were able to sit across from you. So thank you so much. You
bet, Hannah. And I appreciate that because what you just said also helped me as I continue to develop this model in my mind. So thank you.
Oh, good. Very generous.
So actually,
Before
Martin, my
you
question.
jump in, sorry, I got a question from the chat, and I actually had a similar question, so I'm glad someone asked it. Martin, would you mind just like reversing your PowerPoint back to that slide Hannah was mentioning so we can all see it really quick? Thank you. Sorry to interrupt, Robert.
Is this the one or the inclusive leadership one? Hannah was talking about this one, I think. Yeah. Is that the one you were talking about?
Was it that one, Hannah? Okay.
Yeah, that was the one I was talking about.
Yeah.
And then later you have that one with that where you go from the surface to the deep. So those are the
Exactly.
two that I had in mind.
Gotcha.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So Martin, my question relates to Hannah's question somewhat and is a plea for clarification of the concept of weirdness, because if we're talking about this in the context of leadership,
Mhm.
then you're not just weird alone, you're
Mhm.
weird in the context of other people, i.e. your followers. But in some of the examples that you've given so far, namely Michelangelo, he's weird in the context of himself. He doesn't have a team, and he doesn't sort of lead a group of people to follow him. So whether he clips his toenails or takes a bath, is really quite up to him. And so given that part of your definition is that weird is not just special, that there's actually an aversive component to it, whether it's that the individual himself experiences or herself experiences the aversion, or whether other people, like the nasty toenails, experience the aversion. How is it that someone is able to be weird in the context of followers and people who have to not only accept the weirdness, but embrace it to a certain extent, because your theory says that this is productive. Like there's a utility function to the weirdness. It's not just so-and-so's weird and we hate it, but we do our best, but that this is providing value to teams. So can you help clarify some of that?
That's a great question, Robert, because I hadn't thought about it in that way, but here's how I'm thinking about it, is that what I'm talking about now, the content of this particular talk is really about what goes into the development for me as an individual to become an effective inclusive leader. And my argument is simply that in order to do that, I've got to mine and explore my own weirdness. As I'm in leadership, what I do in that context may or may not be as experienced as weird. It will likely vary. The purpose of the mining is to maximize my ability and my flexibility to do whatever needs to be done.
Got it.
So, and the reason I think it's just so important in this context is because if I'm working in vastly diverse contexts, I will continue to be challenged by empathizing, connecting, acting in ways that may be quite different from my normal patterns. And so the flexibility and the capacity to do that, the comfort with doing that is going to be really, really important.
Okay.
So let me move on, then we'll keep talking about this. These are absolutely great questions. So to the extent that in the model, I just really want to, for our purposes in this short period of time, focus on that first box, which is the mining weirdness, exploring one's weirdness. What I want to propose is that there are three fundamental pathways toward doing that. And the one is this notion of a mindful introspection. And I talk about this mindful introspection in the sense of, I will confess that it flows from my own mindfulness practices and my own sort of rather rudimentary Buddhist practice. And part of what I learned in the midst of that practice was this whole notion that as you're sort of sitting and meditating, anyone who's done this, I suspect you've had this experience, you're sitting and meditating, your mind starts wandering and stuff is going on and you're sort of thinking about stuff and so on and so forth. And then at various different points, ideas come up, thoughts come up, and you're like, I don't like that, I don't want that, and you push yourself, you push away from it. That can come out about yourself, it can come up, you may end up thinking about something. I was in a retreat once and there was a woman in the retreat. I don't know this woman to this day. She just happened to be another person there. I hated this woman. And I have no reason, no understanding, no idea why. All she was doing was sitting there meditating. But in my mind, I sort of created this kind of like there was something about her. I had made all these attributions and so on and so forth. And that intrigued me because part of what I realized is that there's a certain practice here of simply identifying for ourselves what are the things that we find aversive or problematic, particularly in ourselves. In fact, we're working with a colleague now to develop a set of studies on priming sort of this notion of differentness and separating it and distinguishing that by also priming on this notion of when did you feel weird in an aversive way, for the simple purpose to find out, to help better understand the ways in which this act of mindful introspection helps surface some of the experiences of weirdness, because part of the premise is that what we begin to see in terms of ourselves are the things that we're sort of identifying and externalizing. So this is one piece, one starting practice around how you explore your weirdness. That in of itself is a useful practice, but it actually is not contextualized for the notion of inclusiveness, where inclusiveness often will require the integration of social identity differences. So whatever context one is in, the important premise for me around inclusive leadership, and it's embedded in the notion of the importance of fairness, for example, is that there are intergroup dynamics that are always at play in the way in which you're leading and what you're leading. And that oftentimes weirdness ends up being played out specifically across social identity. So in my career, I've been frequently the first African-American faculty member in the schools in which I've been. If not the first, the second. And frequently what's happened in that particular context is that me being there has been associated not only with my race, with my youth at a particular time, and all those things created varieties of fault lines within the organization between my senior colleagues, most of whom are white and male, and me. And so this whole notion of inclusion isn't just about, hey, we're all the same, so let's all come together. It means the capacity to engage and differentiate around some of these structural power lines. And so the work also that I've developed in collaboration with Heather Wishick, who I mentioned earlier, unearthed this notion of grounded identity. And so we began to model a way of thinking about our identity that infuses not just the ways in which we're distinctive, but infuses power dynamics. And so here's the basic picture of it. And that is, it's a 2x2 where, given, again, in kind of context dependent way, there is high power and low power. High power is, think privilege. Think across any given dimension of difference, who sits in structural, socially powerful, privileged, advantaged positions, and then who sits in low power positions. In race, it's white versus people of color, gender, male versus female, sexual orientation, heterosexual versus LGBTQ. So that's the distinction on the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, the distinction is simply one of what we'll label as ungrounded versus grounded. Think unskillful, and because I'll give you more specific examples in a moment, but think unskillful versus skillful, ineffective versus effective. And if you look at this, then what I began to capture in the 2x2 through some of the visuals here are sort of exemplars. For example, if we look at ungrounded high power, I think the president is a prime example of it. Is this capacity to sort of, by virtue of social identity, to be part of, to have a set of social identity characteristics that are situated in high power advantage positions, and to be unskillful in the engagement in the context across difference. I also have Russell Simmons there because it's a whole thing around homophobia in Black men and so on that he was engaged in. And these are all examples of sort of being ungrounded. Whereas groundedness, that's where the place where we often find what we often frequently talk about as allies, right? People who are from that high power position, but who are skillful in being not only supportive, but engaged in creating sort of a different, more powerful, more productive outcome. The model also doesn't stick just to the advantage part, but it also interrogates what happens when we're in low power positions too, because we can similarly be ungrounded in those low power positions where the experiences of internalized depression, where the experiences of what happens sort of at a day-to-day microaggressions and so on and so forth throw us off of our balance, put us in positions oftentimes of deep anxiety, hopelessness, fear, depression, anger, rage. And those are places where it becomes incredibly difficult to be effective. In contrast, moving toward groundedness allows us to not let go of who we are in that low power context, but it creates and empowers us and allows us to be effective and engaged and connected in different ways. To just add more to the picture here, what you see here is what we found by doing a variety of these. We basically did workshops where we would sort of engage groups of people. We did this in three different continents, actually. We did in different countries and so on, different cultures. And what we did was we sort of were able to capture descriptively what it looks like in these different 4 cells. And I've included in this particular slide, it's supposed to sort of show up for you, but it didn't do that the right way. The ungroundedness, what we found here is these ideas of people who are ungrounded in their high power identities, oftentimes will exemplify obliviousness. They're not aware of the difference. They're sort of not kind of clued in. That notion of being clueless. Oftentimes they're in denial, which is something slightly different from being truly oblivious, but nevertheless the same thing, which is my difference doesn't matter. I don't have power. I don't have advantage. That's not what's going on. Reactive when confronted with it, which is, here's evidence that you do. No, I don't. You're just making up. You're being overly sensitive. No, that's not true. And ultimately, anxiety and this quality of, what if I do? Okay, I don't want to think about that. So ungroundedness in the high power captures all those things. And not surprisingly, the path between ungrounded and groundedness moves through a sense of things many of you probably sort of thought about, which is, as we go through, there's that notion of shock and shame. How could I have been so oblivious? Guilt, curiosity, ultimately, even consciousness about privilege and about the advantage, and then moves toward this notion of, okay, given all that, what am I going to do? What comes next? I've gone through the angst, I've gone through the anxiety, I've gone through the drama of feeling, oh my, look at me. Now, what is it that I want to be able to do? How is it that I stop walking on eggshells? How is it that I stop sort of being sort of a prisoner of and afraid of this anxiety? And in this grounded place, we found people talking about their experiences of being informed. So seeking out information, the curiosity sort of, I want to learn more about people in these other issues, other dimensions. I want to understand my role in it and so on and so forth. They become engaged, not only with people on the other side of the continuum, but also people on this side. So both engage across difference below and across difference to the left. They also become resilient, because people in the grounded high power place are oftentimes people for whom they catch the blowback. Because ungrounded high power people are relatively inaccessible, when people do want to push back on power, it's the grounded high power people who frequently are the recipients of that. And so it can't be about, hey, but I'm one of the good ones. It's not about that. It's got to be sort of an awareness and a consideration that I'm a member of this group, so what's my role in it? Let me listen to what your story is. And it ultimately creates this notion of experience of freedom. I'm not walking on eggshells. I'm sitting in my body. I am who I am, and I'm moving forward with that. Similarly, there's a pathway on the low power too, from that ungrounded space, which is deeply debilitating for those of us who sort of have that experience, on through a pathway of curiosity, of testing, sort of seeing where we are, experimentation is the way I would think about it. It is curiosity not only about ourselves, but about the other. And it moves over toward this dimension of groundedness, which actually, interestingly, includes many of the same characteristics, both informed, learning more about others, staying more connected, resilient, oftentimes, because these are the people who get called, oh, you're a sellout, or oh, you're not real, you're not a real one of us. So resilience around that becomes important. And then again, this sense of freedom. which is the capacity to sort of feel in your identity, not constrained by the oppressive dynamics, societal dynamics. It doesn't mean that you're not vulnerable to them. It means you're not psychologically in bondage. That's the difference. And so it frees you to then be able to act in different ways that allow you to engage with the reality of what's going on there. And so that's the general notion of grounded identity. And I highlight that as a mining of marginality, because part of what it does is the extent to which we allow ourselves to step into this journey is part of what helps create that kind of self-awareness. Because every single one of us on this call, every single person that I've engaged, as I've talked about this in multiple places, whether they're homogeneous, all dominant, all white male audiences, whether they're deeply diverse audiences, every single one of us has a story in each of these cells. And because we operate in different contexts, then our capacity to explore those cells potentially positions us to move to the right-hand side in either way. So that as the sort of second opportunity for mining marginality, the second tool, the second approach to doing it, is what helps build and give expansion and give texture to this notion of our own weirdness and the ways in which we're unique. The third way, which I'm not going to spend as much time on, given the limits of our time today, is the capacity to connect interpersonally across difference. And the ways in which Erica James and I have written about the notion of creating positive, moving from the positive organizational scholarship literature, ways in which you create high quality connections across difference. And one of the things that I really like about the positive organizational scholarship literature is its ability to focus on generative, positive elements. One of the things that drives me crazy about the discipline is this Pollyannish approach and sort of sense that, hey, let's just do the positive things because those bad things I don't want to deal with. And so Erica and I wanted to step into that because our sense is that connecting across difference, connecting in those places, moving to the places of people with whom you feel aversion is not a negative thing. It's a potentially very generative thing. It may not feel good in the moment, but learning can grow from it. And what I would argue is that if we're talking about mining marginality, those real enacted experiences with people across difference are going to be critically important for that. So those are just, as I'm beginning to think and unpack this conceptually, are some of the ways in which I'm thinking about mining marginality, what that means, and how it can contribute to enhancing this capacity to create inclusive climates. I'm going to stop there. There's more to what I'm trying to develop, but I'm mindful and very much wanting to be engaged and have conversation with you all, and just get your thoughts and reactions and help as I continue to flesh this out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Martin. I see, Michelle, that your hand is up and it's been raised for a while. You've unmuted yourself. Great. Go for it.
I'm actually very glad that I didn't get to ask this question until you went over the second half of your presentation. Thank you so much. Because I am very interested in the process of how people shift and really develop these mindfulness practices and shift from an ungrounded to a grounded state. And my question really focuses on that process in the workplace. And notions of how much is the workplace responsible for helping people transition? How much is it in kind of how much does it benefit a company to do that? And furthermore, obviously these processes don't occur in a vacuum. And so who tends to be given space to engage in this exploration? Who tends to be given space to make mistakes in engaging in this exploration? And kind of how does that play out in the ultimate realization of groundedness, mindfulness, translating that into expressing weirdness and translating that into being a full leader in the workspace?
Yeah. So let me think about what you're saying. Here's how I approach your questions, which is, my preface would be that even as I say this, I'm a psychologist by training with a deeply sort of structural understanding in terms of how I think about my work and how I think about the world and how I think about organizations. And so the extent to which, and by the way, this is completely consistent with my psychological training, right? Which is that what happens in terms of social structures around us deeply influence our behavior and deeply influence our psychology. And so that said, answering your question, one of the things that I think is critical for that in an ideal world organizations would do is that they would create contexts for connection across difference. They would create learning orientations within the organization. That would be ideal for continuing to surface this. They would obviously create the kind of representation in organizations that would allow us to have laboratories for doing this, ideally. I don't think we can ever rely on any of that from any organization. I think that the practice here is designed to be one that focuses on, at least think of it as when you start like a pilot flame, the practices here are designed to be the kinds of things that individually we can do or connected we can do that help get us going. I think that's an important approach for two reasons, maybe one reason, I'm not sure. I think it's an important approach because the nature of oppressive dynamics is such that the pursuit of the right externalized context for doing whatever you do will virtually never happen. It's not that progress isn't made. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think that systems and oppressive systems are intelligent systems. And I think they adapt to find different ways to keep people oppressed. And so part of the purpose of this, and that's why the mindfulness piece is so critically important, I think, is that part of the purpose of the mindfulness piece is that it is a practice. And what's very, very interesting, I should add as a side note, is that within the mindfulness communities, there are emerging factions of mindfulness teachers of color and mindfulness women teachers. And the practice is very, very similar because it's still mindfulness, but there's an acknowledgement that externally diversity matters and that how people learn and engage and share the practice, it matters in terms of who the teachers and practitioners are. That being said, though, that's why I think that as an individual practice, that's my focus on this particular paper. That's an individual, strongly individual and somewhat interpersonal model. I don't think that's the only way to do it. I think that's the one that I want to approach. Does that address your question?
Yes, it does. Partly, I think I loved your paper we read for class, but it made me think a lot of people that I see that appear grounded or display their weirdness openly are people who have privileged identities. Mm-hmm. And that may just be my personal experience. And so I was wondering, is that a nature of my workplace, or is that a function of the world?
Right. The thing that I would say, and I got to tell you, my wife schooled me on this one when we were very, very young, is that we were walking down the street one day and I said to her, because my upbringing and my parents had sort of trained me in such a way. And I said to her, you know what? I said, the problem is Black people aren't doing nothing. That's exactly what I said. And she stopped me in the middle of the street and she said, what the hell are you talking about? And part of what, as she kind of set me straight, but part of what was happening is that I had, in my consciousness, because of what was going on, I had limited access to the variety of models of people who were in low power positions, but were doing amazing things. Amazingly evolved individuals. And oftentimes our models of this, of grounded low power, they may be diminished in any given organization because the people, the individuals certainly aren't there, but we're also sort of being sort of influenced by our own biases and our own sort of sense of, well, the right way is that majority way, white way, or the male way. And so making available psychologically the different models of groundedness for people in low power, I think is very, very important. And I do think there's a subtle distinction between people who act like they're grounded and people who are grounded. But that's another talk.
Awesome, thank you. Our next question is from Evelyn, but Evelyn, before you ask your question, I have a request from the chat. If you wouldn't mind, Martin, just going back a slide. Someone wanted to see that again. And
That-
Evelyn, I'm unmuting you now.
Is this the slide we want to go back to? Or?
Michelle, is that the one you wanted? Or sorry, who asked for that one? Aniko.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for being with us today. Like, I just have to tell you, like, it has been such an impactful week in Dr. Livingston's class. Your work was quite moving, and it was like, it has been a very emotional week for me. So thank you so much for being here today with us. So my question is kind of, I think Michelle like touched on this, but I just want to like extrapolate on something that she had already said. Like as an individual with these like idiosyncratic characteristics, there are underprivileged. There are markers of there are markers of lack of privileges. So for example, like I grew up with like Jamaican host families, like who are extremely loud. And even at a place like Kennedy School, we have discourse around like, let's have a civil disagreement. And so like, and it's like, well, yeah, like I grew up knowing that like, oh yeah, like you're wrong. Like that kind of gesture, like loud and outspoken gesture is normal and quite civil. And
Mm-hmm.
like at Kennedy School, even at Kennedy School is a quite like progressive, inclusive place. And when we talk about civil discourse and like civil disagreement, we always talk about the volume of your voice and like how to approach like your gesture. And it's kind of, right, like there seems to be not a lot of ways for an individual with these types of characteristics to go through this pipeline of success without actually losing and having to adjust their characteristics to what is considered a norm. So like that really concerns me, because for these individuals with lack of power and lack of privilege, the way to survive, like especially when they have been given a place at a space like this, like through a strong advocacy of a sponsor that was really hard to get for an individual with lack of power, they often have no choice but to adjust and conform. So like that really concerns me. So I guess my question to sum it up is like, do you happen to know any practices or habits that these types of individuals can develop so it doesn't, when you get to a place of power, you don't actually lose all these idiosyncratic characteristics that make them weird, but that make them who they are?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. This is totally relevant to Robert's question early on, I think. And I think the question of what are the practices, let me come at it a different way, and let's see if I end up with what are the practices to answer your question in a concrete way. But the way I want to come at it is this. One of the things that I think is inherent in the deep structures, the identity development literature that I was sharing earlier, is this notion that who I am, myself, and losing myself is a surface structure construct. It's not a deep structure construct. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you an example for myself, which is, I talked about this in different places, in my TED Talk and stuff, but when I was in China for the very first time, the experience I had being in China was my first time being in Asia. And when I was there on the very first day, I took a walk. I was happy to be there. I took a walk down the street. And as I was going down the street, I became increasingly anxious as I was just walking. And there was no reason. I mean, people were cool. There were a lot of people, but people were totally cool. And there was it was middle of the day, so nothing like that. But I was getting increasingly anxious. And then I got to a large intersection, I looked across the intersection, and I saw this man standing there. And I don't know if he was European or if he was white American. He was a white guy. And I had this non-conscious reaction, which is, somebody just like me. And I always said to myself, when I tell the story, it's like, I've never looked at a white man and said somebody just like me before. I just never did that before. But once I was in that particular context, part of what happened was that there was a shift, which is, as we know, since context shapes our thoughts about group membership and so on and so forth, group identification, I obviously identify with someone who was not Chinese, right? And I only share that particular story because I had a story about myself as a black man, as a black American man, that had essentially been reinforced and reified when I traveled to Europe, when I traveled to Africa, when I traveled to Latin America. It was kind of the same. that was the first time in my life at that point where I began to have the experience, or I had this aha that my blackness wasn't particularly salient. I had the internalized experience that Chinese people really didn't care about my blackness. I'm not sure they had reference for it. I'm not sure what the reference was. I don't speak Mandarin. But I began to have this experience that, oh my gosh, I thought that I was this, but I may not be this. And there were two things that were attached to that experience. One was, to your point, am I losing something? But what emerged more broadly than that was flexibility. I could call it identity flexibility. What I began to appreciate pretty clearly after that, and then in lots of different situations once I returned to the US, is my blackness and my identity around that doesn't ever go away. It's always there. But I'm also not limited or contained by that identity. And what it did for me is, it ironically, it allowed me to experience myself and be myself more freely as a Black person. And I believe the process that happened was that there was an integration of identity. And so now, at this stage of my life now, where lots of things are supporting my freedom as a Black person, including my status in the institution and so on and so forth at my age. But what happens now is I am from every sort of sense of experience I have, as Black as I can be, whenever I want to be, wherever I want to be. And my sense and freedom around being able to do that is a function of having developed through those things. And so part of what happens for me is I haven't lost anything by sort of going through this process. I haven't lost anything by experiencing myself as more than Black. By checking into my multiple identities, I've actually gained greater flexibility and greater capacity to be who I want to be given the situation. This goes back to your question in a very concrete way, which is that emergence through leadership and developing through leadership, and not every executive who I see experiences in the same way, but it's not a function of, do I have to choose to be this or not be that or lose it? It's how do I begin to integrate who I am to connect with the tasks that need to be done at that particular stage.
So Martin, can I just for a second try to clarify what and Evelyn, correct me if I got this wrong, but I think her question is maybe a little more about what we might call code switching. So that if you're in a particular environment, let's say you're at the dinner table, Jamaican Americans, and you're loud, right, which is the term that she used, are you allowed to be loud when you go to work? Can you carry aspects of what other people might say or believe to be weirdness because they're not around people who sound like they're arguing, but they're really just talking? Mm-hmm. Can you be that way in the workplace, or do you have to tone it down once you enter that environment so that people are not afraid of you at best, or so that they don't penalize you by lashing out when you violate prescriptive norms in that environment that pretty much say the proper way to have a discussion or a disagreement is with this tone of voice? And Evelyn, is that kind of capturing what?
Spot on.
Got it. Okay, that's great. And my simple answer to this is, when you're developing the practices around groundedness, you can do whatever the hell you want. Now, as you do that, groundedness affords you two things. One is it affords you the internal ability, freedom, sense that you can do whatever you want. And it also affords you the capacity to be able to read the room and to read your environment. Because your development and your choices about what you want to do are predicated on your decision about what your mission is, what you're trying to achieve, and so on and so forth. If you're trying to move up in a particular company, and the cultural requirements and the organizational requirements around code switching are highly in place, you have a choice at an early stage of career about what you want to do around that. We always talk about this. We've talked about this. I had a couple of mentees around hair. It's like, you don't have to cut your hair. You don't have to cut your locks. there are consequences to not doing that given the place you've chosen to be. When you're grounded, you can actually create even a, dare I say, a strategy, which is, you know what, in the short run, I'm gonna have to cut my hair. I'm gonna have to code switch. I'm gonna have to do that. In the long run, I'm gonna attain a level of influence and power in this place where I'm gonna begin to change the norms. Which you do, by the way, not only by making structural changes as we've talked about, but also just by being yourself differently and showing people that there's a way to be culturally aligned in this organization. Something that when you're a token, for example, you don't see. But I think for me, that distinction is really, really important though. That internalized distinction, which is you have the choice to do whatever you want to do, and that the environment is what it is, and so you're deciding how you want to engage in that environment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, and it was very powerful. Thank you so much.
You bet. You bet.
Great, thank you. And I see our next question is from Rayma. Rayma, I'm going to unmute you now. Rayma, are you there?
Hi. Yes, I'm here.
Great.
Thank you. This is a very interesting topic because I think I'm one of those who are always weird and people wonder. But yes, going back to Martin, what you're talking about, and I was watching the other day what Brené Brown was talking about, being vulnerable but having courage at the same time. As a leader, how do you really embrace your weirdness, but at the same time remain authentic, at the same time promote inclusiveness without losing who you are and your real identity?
I think that the notion of the real identity, it connects to my previous remarks. What I will say is that I think that the ability to mind this weirdness and to practice, to sort of get more comfortable with these behaviors that we assumed or probably had lots of evidence that we assumed would cause us to be rejected. Part of what I learned from talking to the weird people is that they basically began to build the muscle of, well, look, let me experiment. Let me just be myself. Let me just show that part. And yes, sometimes I'm going to get some bad blowback from that. But then they also said, but a lot of times the one person over there said, hey, that was kind of cool. There were only one voice. There was 5 that were saying, you know, hey, tone it down. But there was one who was saying, oh, that was kind of cool. And so they experimented with being different, with being weird. And they talked about that as being something that was helpful along the way. It didn't solve all ills, but they found it to be sort of encouraging and energizing. But I think that this notion of experimentation, of who you are and seeing how the different facets of yourself connect and adapt to different settings is a really important activity to undertake for anybody. But I think it's also really important for those of us who are in environments that continually to highlight our identity as wrong or as needing to be changed. I think the capacity to continue to test assumptions around that and to do it in intelligent and calculated ways, and that experiments are always about, doing real experimentation is not only about sort of getting the positive result, but it's also getting the null result. So I think that ongoing learning that we engage by trying out, pushing the boundary a little bit. The analogy is, it's so funny, I'm talking to you all, it's so interesting that I'm talking to you all in this talk about dynamics of societal oppression more than I ever talk about this. But the analogy is the electric fence and the ways in which our organizations are continually, and not just organizations, but society, are continually creating electric fences around which we have learned not to touch because they'll be shocked. But then oftentimes you'll find yourself in a variety of settings, especially if you're choosing your environment, choosing your organization, choosing your job, choosing your context, where there is no electricity, but we still don't touch the fence because we assume it's going to be there. And so the capacity to experiment, to reach out to in intelligence, careful ways to test and see what my boundaries really are. How weird can I be? What part of my self that I thought was unacceptable can I actually share? And people actually don't freak out. That's an ongoing task, ongoing experiment.
Great, thank you so much. Our
Thank you.
Our next question is from Amal. Amal, I'm unmuting you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. Hi, Martin. It's really
Hi.
very interesting. And also your comment, Robert. I myself is a Bedouin, indigenous Bedouin who came from Palestine. And I went through an amazingly same process from in my teenage time as an activist. I was one of us. Then when I start challenging the structure of the society and getting into the issues that we have to change as a society, especially as a woman, I became a traitor. I became an outsider. I became someone they don't want to see. And then in my 40s, I get back to the society in a way that I'm back part of the society, but it all became, took this journey because I worked on this exact process of how to liberate people from this victimization and defeated mindsets towards proud self-confidence and understanding their place in society. So my question, and I really think this is a great model, and I agree with people who said, how are we gonna do this with different groups, this process? But my question is, if marginality situation, the context of marginality is still going on, would you see this process as an accomplished process that has an end? Or you see this as also part of the dynamic of liberating people from marginality, where the political oppression is still there? Do you see this kind of liberation?
Yeah, I think if I understand your question, thank you for your story too, because I think that's very powerful how that shifts over time. If I understand your question correctly, I don't think that the experience of marginality and this high power, structural high power, low power will ever go away. I think it's psychologically hardwired. I think that's kind of how we are, and I think lots of social psychological experiments over the years have sort of demonstrated this fluidity of in-group, out-group, and so on and so forth. I think that the skill for leaders around, okay, I know this is always going to be present, and it will take different forms. As we have different cultures and different kinds of people coming together, different gender identities. So, they will always take different forms. But I think the underlying skill set, which is how do I create a context and engage in practices that allow people to stay engaged, just to fairly be connected. I think that will be an ongoing, useful skill set and capability.
And do you see this working the same with women leadership programs, gender women leadership program? Do you see the same model would work in terms of creating inclusive leadership among women?
I drew some of the theoretical background from Robin Ely's work and from Deborah Rohde's work, and they're talking specifically about women's leadership development. And the parallels are very strong, very clear here, yeah. And Rob and I have talked about this too. So I do think that potentially, yes, I think the proof is in the pudding. We have to start engaging these practices and see what happens, but I do think so. I'm a player in our women's leadership development program here at DARD, and we're incorporating some of these principles into that program. Of course, we're not doing anything now, but, but we will hopefully in the fall.
Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you.
Great. And our next question, I see Maria Rodriguez. I'll unmute you now.
Hi, Martin.
Hi, Maria.
Thank you for your talk. Can you elaborate a bit on how grounded and ungrounded high-power individuals can relate productively to create change and to create inclusiveness in the workplace?
So you're saying high power, grounded, and ungrounded? Got it.
Yes.
Got it. Yeah. That's a good question. I think that I'm drawing on, because I'm just exploring your question, I'm drawing on my own experience too. Because when I think about myself as a male leader in this institution, excuse me, and you know, what I'm aware of is it's a very slippery slope, in the sense that I find it, especially when the ungrounded people are nice, I find it oftentimes difficult to maintain my grounding. And that when I think about it, part of what helps orient me as a grounded, in my moments of being grounded, by the way, because that's why it's not like a continue, oh, made it, I'm grounded, that's great. It's not like that. It can be very variable. The idea is, how do you maintain yourself in a grounded place more? Part of what I do is I use my relationships with people in low power contexts to help orient me and to help calibrate. So when I'm working with another colleague who I really like this guy, he's so great. We really hit it off. We really did, you know. And I'm also looking at the people who work with him and saying, so what's going on? And then if there's a story, then it helps remind me that, okay, I can sit with this person who at a individual level I can have very positive connections with, but I can also see that from our group power dynamic that he's operating in a way that is problematic. And then it's feedback time and conversation time. And in the best situations that I've imagined, it's actually been pretty cool, because I can leverage the positive relationship and connection I have with him to influence him. It's not always easy, but it happens. Right? So that's an example that I have around gender. That's how I think about it.
Awesome, thanks. And I see one last hand raised from Arushi. Arushi, I'm unmuting you now.
Hi, thank you.
Hi, Arushi.
First of all, thank you, Martin, for the talk. I think it's really powerful. And my question actually ties really well into what we're talking about right now. So I was just noticing how so many of us here have shared that they come from some or the other marginalized identity. And so it got me thinking that, like, one, what is the role that we can play in positions of power to influence people from privileged identities? And how can we use sort of like this model of grounded leadership in that context? And second, is this a context which might be valuable for people from privileged identities, again, like at its own face value? Thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. If I understood the first part of your question too, you were asking if I'm a marginalized person and I become in places of influence, can I use this? Okay.
Yeah, and how can I specifically use this to sort of like build alliances and influence people with privileged identities to become allies?
Yeah, gotcha. Here's what I'll say. What I have found, and I end up having lots of engagements with senior white executives and groups of them, and they like me. I can be very effective with them, and I've always and part of it, or I always question. I say, you know, it goes into that place of, oh, am I selling out? Am I doing something? I realize that part of what's happening, though, that's creating the effectiveness is because I find myself oftentimes being more forthright with them, more in the face with them. But I found that what I think what happens is, speaks to your question, is I have the capacity in myself to experience them as human beings, and to put aside the pattern and what for me has been trained in, which is this is just this majority guy, they're clueless, they don't get it, blah, 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 blah. And instead, part of what I experience is a sense of, okay, you're a human being, I can connect with you, and I can see our common humanity. Now, that said, let's roll up our sleeves and get to work, because you're doing some messed up stuff here. And there's something around the ability to simultaneously hold that appreciation for someone's humanity and I don't know, for me, humanity incorporates the capacity to be good and so on and so forth, but to simultaneously hold that and also to hold people accountable for their actions, behaviors, and approaches. And the ability to do that, I have found to be a very influential tool. with my colleagues in real time, but also when I'm an external person as a teacher or a consultant or whatever. Because I think that part of what the grounded model provides is that the reason I often share it is not because it's necessarily a tool to get other people to do stuff. I think it is. I think it's a tool of self-liberation. It's a tool of freedom. It's a tool that when you do it, you become free. You can do whatever the heck you want. You can be a warrior for change and justice, or you can go sit on the beach. Doesn't matter. But the capacity to be free, to be cognitively, psychologically, mentally, emotionally free is what it provides. And then from there, we'll each approach whatever it is we want to do. And I think that becomes a source of influence when you're talking about being in organizations that work with other people. The thing that is harder for people is when they're put in corners and they're sort of pushed to the side and forced to do something. But when they're sort of invited and compelled, then that's a different story. Does that help? Okay.
Definitely. Thank you.
Okay, you bet.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Arushi, for your question, for ending our session today. And thank you very much, Martin, for taking time out of your schedule and driving up from your thriving farm to get an internet connection so that you can join us today. I appreciate that sacrifice on your part. And I think we gained a lot from your perspective on diversity and inclusion today. So thank you everyone for joining. And next week we will have Sakira Hudson, and Dr. Hudson will talk to us about divergence between descriptive and prescriptive stereotypes and expectations for gay men and lesbian women. So please join me next week.
Great.
And thank you everybody, and have a wonderful and safe weekend. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.